voice is shot. I can't believe it. This cold has made a comeback. Don't tell anyone that I have this in here. It's against the rules. I don't want to get busted or anything. So don't let anybody know. If you see me do this and take a sip, it's so that I don't end up coughing like crazy. That's what keeps happening. The more that if I start talking, I get that catch in my throat. So if I cough convulsively, you know why. I'm supposed to be way past the point of being contagious, but I got this scratchy throat. It's the pits. Anybody had this yet, this cold that's going around? Oh, yeah, well, okay. Which one of you gave it to me then? Oh, I see. That's why nobody's sitting up front. You're all back there. I got you. Okay. Nehemiah chapter 9 is where we are tonight. And if you've ever taken the time to study through the book of Nehemiah, this is the part of the book that I really, actually this chapter in particular, I really love this chapter because it calls you to a place of observance for yourself, for your own life and all that. And it's kind of a recognition of everything that God has done in your life to bring you to the point where you are. Now, this is very much it's a historical Jewish reckoning of history. There's no question about it. You don't want to spiritualize it or make it anything more than it actually is. But what it does, it demonstrates in very wonderful terms the patience of God. And when He has something that He's going to do, which is in this case, Ezra's going to review hundreds of years of their history. But it's because God has work that He's going to be doing down the road in them. So He endures through all of their failure because God sees the big picture. He knows the finished product, and He is patient while those things get worked out. In this case, remembering what brought them to this point and how Nehemiah had been brought back in kind of the third wave of things. Zerubbabel began the repopulating and then the rebuilding of the temple and the structure, but it was really never much completed through him. Along comes Ezra, who is going to bring back the law and bring back the proper worship as it should have been. And then Nehemiah comes along and gets back to the fortification of this place, Jerusalem. So that's where we are historically, but think about all that has taken place to that point. And he does exactly by beginning at Abraham, talking to these people and reminding them of the covenant that was made with them through Abraham by God. And so, of course, it goes through Moses. It goes through all of the kings. By this time, all of the major prophets have spoken, and now they are back in the land after the 70 years of captivity, and then all the other stuff that happened even after those 70 years. So that tells us where we are in the history, and Ezra is able to recount that for them. But what I want to make sure that we do, and that we're careful to do, is to recognize the elements or the aspects of God's nature. How does He interact with His people? And so God did this work in this nation, the Jewish people, the Hebrews, call them what you will, the people that were the inhabitants of Israel, the people of the covenant. And you'll see how He interacts with them, and you will find some interesting parallels of how He interacts with us and His patience towards all of those people with whom He's made covenant. That's the important part. So, chapter 9, last time that we were together and looking at this, we looked at the first 6 verses of chapter 9. We're going to go back and recount a couple of those. And then what Ezra ends up doing is he makes the people that were hearing him totally accountable to themselves. And so accountability is a very, very important thing for us. We should recognize who God is. The things that He does is supposed to bring us to a place of decision and reckoning. And so He does that in chapter 9 here. Having turned there, let's have a word of prayer and we'll start. Father, we thank You for gathering us here this evening, and we pray, Father, that You would give us hearts and minds that are able to comprehend and to think back and remember the great work that You have done, not only for these people at this time. This enduring covenant that You made with Abram all the way back in Genesis is still unfolding in our day with Your people Israel. And yet at the same time You have another covenant that You have made through the blood of Jesus, a new covenant that Jesus spoke about, written in His blood. To those who have put their faith in Him, there is a covenant that is for them as well. And eternity is the promise. And so, God, we would pray that as we see how you interact with your covenant people of the Old Testament and how that even forwards to today, would you help us to recognize the things that you have done in making covenant with us, the believers in Jesus. Help us to understand and appropriate these things, making proper application to it. We give you thanks, we give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen? So chapter 9 begins this way. Verse 1 says, "Now on the 24th day of this month, the children of Israel were assembled with fasting, with sackcloth and dust on their heads." And so an outward visible way of saying that this is, when you would see somebody doing that, they're in a state of mourning. And the reason that they're mourning the condition of things, and it's a sign outwardly of repentance and of a heart that recognizes something that's taken place, and it's turning their attention towards the Lord. Verse 2 is a place where we want to make, again, those applications to ourselves, and it's the matter of consecrating. It's the matter of separation from the things of the earth, from the things of the world. And so recognizing that they were a unique people, they were supposed to act accordingly. So verse 2 tells us, "Then those of Israelite lineage," those were the people that were the covenant as far as a national sense is concerned. What's your DNA? Where are you from? Well, if you're Israelite here, and you are of those covenant people, the ones who either came back from the captivity or the ones who would have been the inhabitants of the land, but you trace yourself back to the covenant people, that's who's being addressed here. So these were of that lineage. They separated themselves from all of the foreigners, and they stood and they confessed their sins and the iniquity of their fathers. So it wasn't a stretch for these people who were here to recognize what brought them to this occasion. Again, they're still looking at, though they had rebuilt the fortifications, it still would have had all of the outward signs of the destruction that came at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It's still there. Now, when we go to Israel next month or next year, and we go and we take a look around the Temple Mount area, we'll still be able to see the remnant of what happened when Rome and Titus did the damage to the Temple Mount area. You can still see the stones that had come down, and it was a fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. But you can see where things used to be, and you can see how all of it was in place, but then it was ultimately destroyed. So it doesn't take much for anybody to look at that, if they're going to be honest with their history, and say, this is when, as Jesus prophesied, that not a stone would be left upon another. That's why the temple's not there anymore. And you can see the remnant of that destruction in various places when you look around Jerusalem, or other places within Israel as you tour around the place. So, this same accounting is happening as Ezra is here. Calls the people to a place of consecration. Separation from the rest of the world. Exactly the same kind of thing that Paul talks about when he's mentioning it to the Corinthians. That we should separate ourselves from the things of the world and not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Because as Paul would say, what fellowship does light have with darkness? So he gives those examples of, polar opposites of things. What fellowship can this have with that? So this idea of separation. But not to the point where we don't interact with the world, because we're supposed to evangelize and reach the world. So how do you balance those two things out? Or as Jesus would say, in it but not of it, right? So we are to engage the world, yes, but we're not to be tarnished by the world. We're not to become like them and participate in the abominable things that the world does. Same thing that's happening here. So you see the application? We can look at verse 2 and say, they separated themselves. If they did that back then, should that same principle hold true today? We consecrate ourselves to the Lord, but we still interact with the world. So it says, they stood in their place, they read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for a fourth of the day, and for another fourth of the day they confessed. They also worshipped the Lord. So the confession is the acknowledgement of their guilt, and then the worship, how do you reconcile those two? We're so sorry for what we did, well, how do you worship? Well, first of all, they had offended the God who is now receiving their worship. That speaks of His mercy and His graciousness and His willingness to put up with things. Pretty cool stuff. So then verse 6 comes around. He says, you alone are God. You have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens, with all of their hosts, the earth and everything on it, the seas and everything in them. and you preserve them all. The host of heaven worships you. And I mentioned this when we were here a couple of weeks ago about how interesting this is, that they would be speaking about events that the New Testament would tell us were done by and through the person of Jesus Christ. So we know that He's the one through whom God made the worlds, right? Or the heavens, rather. All the things that we see in a physical sense. We're studying that on Sunday mornings. So isn't it cool? Here Ezra is ascribing something to God's handiwork that we as Christians, because we look back to the person of Jesus Christ, we would say we have much more definition about how these things occurred than they did. It was right and it was honorable that they would say, God, you created. We'd be able to say, now this God that they spoke about, we know Him in a deeper way in Revelation sense, that person is Jesus. But the same holds true. It's God and God alone who creates. And so they say all these things. Just really, really cool stuff. Well, as we read on in verse 7, it says, you are the Lord God, and you chose Abram. You brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and you gave him the name Abraham. Now, this goes to the beginning of the covenant. This is all the way back at Genesis chapter 12. When He says He's going to do this great work. Now, Abram, if we just look at it in a literal translation, means exalted father. Now, only one little letter changes his name from Abram to Abraham, and the difference is night and day. It means you're going to be the father of many. So, Abram, exalted father. Abraham, father of many. And we're going to find that as we study through this, Ezra reminds them. Again, remember, this is a history lesson for the people that are listening. They separated themselves from the world. They came directly before Ezra and consecrated themselves to the Lord. And now they're going to get a history lesson, not unknown to them, but a recounting and a remembrance of that history. That's what's taking place here. So he's able to say to these people, let's all remember where we came from. God made a covenant with Abram, exalted father, changed his name to Abraham, who is the father of many, and the assembled people there would have to say, and we are among that many. We're innumerable in numbers and even going forward in history, innumerable. Remember one of the other promises that was made to Abraham. It was made to him that through you the nations will be blessed. But remember, when he makes this covenant with Abram, it's one nation. It's one group of people. It's not the entirety of the world. He made it with the Jewish people. Now, how is it then it goes from singular, the Jews, to that through the work or through the life of Abraham and through his descendants that nations, plural, could be blessed? It comes through Jesus. Because he is offspring of David, yes, but all the way back to Abraham. And because of the work that Jesus did, the nations, plural, all of mankind, is potentially blessed because salvation has come to Jew and Gentile alike. It's what we were looking at this morning. So, interesting how this, if you can see big picture, you can look at these particular parts and say, there's so much more going on. But we have the fortune of being able to look back in 2,500 years of history and say, boy, how God has expanded the picture, right? So here we go. You are the Lord God. You chose Abram. You brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans, gave him the name Abraham. And you found his heart faithful before you, and you made a covenant with him to give him the land of the Canaanites. Now this is still going on, and it's a debate in our world today, because Israel is now again established in the land. And this really does become a little bit of a debate in the church. The idea of God choosing and all the rest of it. And there are some on the one extreme end of it that would say really mankind has no choice whatsoever. And everything, and I mean everything, is ordained by God, and we're just kind of fulfilling everything and He's directing everything. We have no will of our own. I totally disagree with that. I believe that He's given man total free will to do what he's going to do, and there will be a consequence for those decisions, but he moves upon the hearts of men, and he creates situations, but he gives man the will to decide for himself what he's going to do. So how then do we reconcile passages like this? He chose Abraham. Well, does that mean that he directed him? Or his choosing of Abraham was because he would know how Abraham was going to react to the questions? Abraham, do you trust me? Do you want to follow me? Remember, that's the beginning of all these things. Abraham, I want to take you to a place. Or Abram, I want to take you to a place, a land you've never visited, but I'm going to give it to you as an inheritance. Now, of course, God knew that he would be faithful to that. Paul had a similar thing that happened with him too. God asked him, do you want to do this thing? Tells him what he's going to do through him, but Paul had to choose to do what he was going to do. But I believe in both cases, God puts out the invitation knowing the answer of the person to whom he has invited to do this great work. Abraham, Paul, you and me. He knows the answer, so he puts out the invitation. I believe that's exactly what you see here. So notice that it says, Ezra speaking, you found his heart, speaking of Abram. You found it faithful before you. God already knew that he would be faithful to the call, but it was proven. You found it to be faithful. And so you made a covenant with him to give him the land of the Canaanites. And so people flip out over this whole thing. The Jews are the usurpers. They're kicking the people out of their homeland. All that stuff, right? We hear that all the time. Israel is, the poor Palestinians and all the rest of it. Stop. It is God's land to begin with. So he can give it to whomever he wills. It's not that the Jews are taking anything from anyone. It was given to them in the first place by the person who is the only one who has the right to give it to whom he wills. So right here, notice it says, you gave the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, all the ites, you gave it to them. You took it from those people, you gave it to the ones that you had designed it for in the first place. And let's also remember, the fact that he had to make this covenant even with Abram is because all the way back at Adam and Eve, the way that things should have been in the first place had not worked out as it should have because man sinned. They rebelled against God. Well, here as history would record, God says, now is the time. I'm going to make my covenant with my people, and they're going to inhabit a land that I am going to give them. It is currently occupied by people that I have not given it to, though they are in that land. So I am going to give it to whom I will to give it. And it's where all the ites live. So here it is. And they're going to go to this land. God gave it to a specific group of people. So if people get all upset about that, well, the Jews, look at the West Bank, look at Gaza. I don't care. Right here it tells me who God gave it to. Now if you have a problem with that, take it up with him. He's the one who gave it to them. It's his possession to give to whom he wills. All right? So it says in at the second part of verse 8, it says to give it to his descendants, and you performed your words. You've done these things. Here we are. They're evidence of it, though they've gone through a horrible bit of history from that time on. Now, from the time that all that work was done in Abram until the time that we are looking at here in Ezra's time, they had times of just enormous victory, no question about it. I think especially of times like David when they had possessed the land and there was the proper worship, there was the temple that was built, and the nations around were in a place of honoring this king and this kingdom, David, and the place there. It was just the way that it should always have been. It didn't last very long, did it? Think about it. After David comes Solomon, and Solomon with all of his ups and downs, by the time he leaves, Rehoboam does a silly thing, splits the kingdom. It's given over 10 tribes to the north under Jeroboam, and it never got it together. And it was wiped out not long after. And then here is this remnant down in the south. And so as Ezra is speaking, they know all of this history. For the most part, more of that history was of failure than of success. But is that not kind of the human existence? We tend to fail at a lot of stuff, especially when it comes to God setting a perfect standard. Boy, you want to see failure? Let God say, this is what I expect. Now go do it. You guys not convinced? I'm convicted by that. Just thinking about it. How often God sets such a high standard and a high bar, and how I will fail in my own flesh. But God knows such things. So it says, you performed your good words, for you are righteous. Oh, that is such salve to the heart. The idea that it is God who is righteous, not us. Now, he transitions to the time of Moses. And think of all the stuff that would have been skipped over, if you will, from that covenant. Because by that time you have Abraham, right? You have Isaac and Jacob and the sons, the 12 sons, the tribes, that time in Egypt where they come back after all that time of captivity and the drought and all that stuff. He fast forwards to Moses, the next, if you will, really hugely significant event in this national history, Moses. So you saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt. So you saw, you were attentive. You heard the cry at the Red Sea. Now, isn't it funny? There wasn't all of them crying out to God. Half of them were complaining. They get to the Red Sea. And it's like, oh, great, you bring us out here into the wilderness, telling us that God wants us here, and now here comes the Egyptian army, and we're stuck at the water. We're all dead. So what does Moses do? Of course, he seeks God. God says, I'll part the water. Do you trust me? Go do this. So water parts. In fact, I shouldn't probably admit this. It was on television, so I kind of like, anytime Hollywood tries to make a movie about biblical accounts, I always get a little nervous. Because they take such crazy license with it. It was the Exodus thing. I don't even remember who was in it, but it was the most recent movie of the Exodus and all the rest of it. So the latest Hollywood thing about, they get to the Red Sea. And they show part of it where the people, there's this, sweeping river that's coming away and the people are like up to here in the water. And, after a while it finally recedes. Well, it tells me that they went through on dry land. So was it dry land or was it what Hollywood's saying, that it kind of, a little bit kind of dried up and then finally, there's still puddles of water all over the place? I really think if it says dry land, it means dry land. And I think that the reason why it would be dry land is so everybody would be able to look at it and say, oh, this is no small-time miracle. This is big league stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if walls, of water were just right there next to them and they walked through it like a column. That would make sense to me. Because as they would look up, they would go, this doesn't happen on its own. And I remember watching a National Geographic thing, and I'll try to make this brief because I don't want to run out of time. This is an important chapter. But I remember watching this, and I shook my head in disbelief. I couldn't believe what I was watching. And it was some professor, someplace, and I think it was even here in the country, and he was trying to explain the Exodus. And so this is no joke. They constructed a big looking like fish tank kind of a thing, and it was plexiglass so that you could see that in one part of the plexiglass they had built up like sand or something like that, that underneath the water, just below the surface of the water, was this land. And he takes out a leaf blower, and he starts blowing the water to show that the water was pushed aside and it revealed this dry part of the land, or land that people could have walked across. And he says, now the winds that come along through that part of Egypt, at particular times it can blow excessively hard and, part the water enough that people would be able to walk across. So trying to, in earthly terms, explain a miraculous thing. And of course the joke becomes, and the folly of that whole thing is that, some event that they're talking about that allowed for Israel to walk across on dry land somehow also drowned an entire Egyptian army. So which is the bigger miracle here? The fact that that wind blew, they still have that problem about how was it that the Israelites walked across on dry land but the Egyptians drowned, using their theory. Well, in the movie that I watched, of course, they have to show that Pharaoh and Moses come face to face as the water comes crashing in on them. The scripture doesn't say that. It says that the water parted, they went across, and as they get across, the water comes back and it drowns the Egyptians. That's what the text tells me. Well, right here, kind of the same thing. Notice what verse, you saw the affliction of your people. God was obviously aware of it, but he saw it. Notice that it says, you heard their cry. You showed signs and wonders to Pharaoh. Yeah, the water walled up. And you showed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and against his servants and against all the people of his land. For you knew that they acted proudly against them. And so the time came when God wanted his people out because of the way that the Egyptians had treated them. So he's reminding them of this part of their history. So, you made a name for yourself as it is this day. We remember. You did great and marvelous things, and so you have done them again. You've brought us back from our captivity. He's about to mention to them, oh, by the way, you're bringing us back, and it's not because of something that you did wrong, it's because of us. So, verse 11, you divided the sea before them, so that they went through in the midst of the sea on dry land. I believe it was dry land. I don't even think it was muddy. I don't. I think that if it says dry land, I believe that it's dry land because it would be more miraculous if it was dry. It'd be one thing for the water to recede and pull aside, but it really gets your attention if it's dry. I think it's dry. And then and their persecutors, it says their persecutors you threw into the deep as a stone into mighty waters. So into the deep. Again, how do you describe this other than it was a miraculous thing? The water was deep. God parted it, let his people go through. It came back where it was because the enemies drowned in the deep. I think it's pretty as straightforward as it could possibly be. Verse 12, moreover, you led them by day with a cloudy pillar, and by night with a pillar of fire, to give them light on the road which they should travel. So this we know from the time of Exodus, that during the daytime there was a cloud that covered them in their time, and it was a way of directing them. And then at night, this pillar of fire. It was illuminating to them that they could see where it was that they were going. God provided for those. Book of Exodus. And he says, and you came down also at Sinai, and you spoke with them from heaven. Now it was through Moses that he had spoken to them. Now, the people heard all of what was being said. God did not communicate directly to them. He did it through Moses. It says, you spoke to them from heaven, and you gave them just ordinances, true laws, good statutes, and commandments. And you made known to them your holy Sabbath, and commanded them precepts, statutes, laws, by the hand of Moses, your servant. So, this is again for their history. They would understand the time of their wandering around came to a place, Sinai, Mount Sinai, where God met directly with Moses, gave him the law, gave him direction, and all of the things that they should do. Not just the 10 Commandments, but the things that came after that. We can read about those in the first 4 books really, where it gets from Exodus through those 5 books. So getting into Leviticus and then Numbers and Deuteronomy, you can read about their history, but also the things that were expected of them. Now, interestingly enough, since we are in John and the book of Hebrews on Wednesday night, we know that the things that God had communicated through the person of Moses, we know that, especially what we'll be looking at in the next few weeks on Sunday mornings, that God has communicated much more fully in the person of Jesus Christ. In fact, in John 1:17, it says the law came through Moses, or the law was given through Moses, but grace and mercy came through Jesus Christ, or grace and truth. So there was this mediation, if you will. There was God through Moses to man, but in Jesus he's come directly to us, and he has delivered any message that needs to be given to us in person. So, application part of this. You did what you did at Sinai through Moses to the people. In these days, we have a much better understanding and reckoning through the person of Jesus. He takes out the questions. Now we understand such things. And so it says, all these things that were given, verses 13 and 14. You came down. You came and delivered a message to Moses, to the people. Fast forwarding to our time. You came down, not to Moses. You came down to all men through Jesus, the Son, God in our midst. So then verse 15 says, and you gave them bread from heaven for their hunger, and you brought them water from the rock for their thirst. So this is Exodus. This is the manna that was on the ground when they woke in the morning. And of course, it's always worth mentioning, but the idea of manna, even what they called it, manna simply means, what is it? So every morning when they woke up, what is it? That stuff. The white bread-looking stuff. What is it? That's what they called it. Well, because they had never seen it before. It was supernatural provision. God made provision for them. So you gave them that, and then you also gave them water. Water doesn't ordinarily come from rocks. It did in their case, because God provided for them. So you gave them bread from heaven for their hunger, and you brought them water out of the rock for their thirst. And you told them to go into and possess the land which you had sworn to give them. Who did you swear to give it to them? Through whom? Abraham. Yeah. So this history lesson said, look, all of what has brought us to where we are today, Ezra's time, with all of the ebb and flow of our history and the establishing of the land, promised to Abraham, given to the people at the time of Moses, though Moses was not the one who led them in, and he's going to get to that history as well. But you've led us to this place where even now we, the people assembled here in Nehemiah's writings through the words of Ezra, is bringing them to a recognition that we are in this land simply because you have chosen so. And you've brought us to this place. So, you swore it to them, to the fathers. Now verse 16. But they and our fathers, they acted proudly. They hardened their necks, they did not heed your commandments, and they refused to obey. Boy, oh boy, what a list of things. Now, this is a problem of the human condition. This is not a problem with Israel. Israel was doing what humans do. How do we know? Because we have ourselves for an example. Now, if we don't want to be honest with ourselves, we can blame our kids. They're like this, right? Look at, here's the problem. They acted proudly. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Kids do that, right? We, of course, don't. We're adults. We're all grown up. We quit worrying about our own will, right? Yeah, right. We acted proudly, or they acted, our fathers, they acted proudly. They hardened their necks, which is a great illustration. Any of you guys that have ever had to deal with horses or mules, donkeys, that kind of thing, if you go to pull on them and they don't want to be pulled on, their neck is stronger than your ability to pull usually, right? They stiffen their necks. I love the Bible talks about that they have their necks have sinews made of iron. I think it's Proverbs that says that. That's a stiff neck. That's resisting. And so here these people did too. Means that God couldn't direct them because they would stiffen up their neck. God's trying to pull them in a direction. They don't want anything to do with it, so they stiffen their necks. They get rigid. Well, you can see what it led to. It led to them not wanting to heed your commandments. So then they refused to obey. Now, refusal takes the will. There are plenty of times that we do things and we do it by mistake because we haven't thought about it. Or we just act rashly. We don't have good information. In this case, you have to, if you're going to refuse something, you have to know that the parameters have been laid out for you so that you can refuse. Well, they had everything. God had given them everything. The modern application to us is to know exactly what God's Word says and say, I refuse to do it. I will not do what God has told me to do. So, like them, so with us. They refused to obey. And they were not mindful of your wonders. They would not remember such things, which made the refusal all that much easier. So they were not mindful of your wonders that you did among them, but they hardened their necks, as in the rebellion, to appoint a leader to return to their bondage. Now, if you don't know where that is, that's chapter 14. That is where they're supposed to go into the land. This is Numbers 14. This is the whole Joshua and Caleb thing. So if you remember, that was when they went in and spied the land. If you go and read that, you'll find that after the report comes back from those spies, they had said, it's time for us to go ahead and leave and go back to Egypt. And it was a way of them looking at Moses and saying, we don't want to follow your lead anymore. Let's get a brand new leader and let's go back to Egypt. That was there. After all that they had done, they are at the doorstep of the land that God had promised to them and said, we don't like the report that we've heard. Let's get a new leader and let's go back. Now, the equivalent to us, as we understand, what was it that God removed them from in Egypt? What was their life there? Bondage, slavery, exactly, right? Now, in the New Testament sense, slavery and bondage is made synonymous with sin. So sin is bondage. Sin is slavery. We were enslaved to it. Paul talks so much about that. We who were once enslaved were in bondage to sin. Jesus has set us free. So the equivalent would be us coming right to the point where we're coming into all the promises that are made to us in Jesus and say, you know what, I'm going to go back to the world. That's the equivalent here. And that was what they had done in their temptation of God. Now we know the way that the rest of it went down. God heard what they had to say. Read the rest of Numbers 14, and this is the way that it went down. Of course, Moses and Aaron heard this, and it was terrible. They were broken at this. But even they did not come with the same kind of trust in God that Joshua and Caleb did, because they were the ones that said, wait a minute, I don't care what the land holds as far as what we see with our eyes. What we know is that God made a promise. His promise is greater than any problems that are represented in the land. Let's go. And God looked at them and said, hey, even you, Moses and Aaron, you're going to die out here in the wilderness. But those guys, they're going in. Why? Their level of trust was sky high. Why? They trusted the promise. The promise and the covenant that God had made was the superior thing. So all of the what-ifs that are underneath that, they said irrelevant. That stuff doesn't matter. The promise trumps everything. And God looked at that and said, exactly. Now those are the ones that are going to come in. And the kicker was that the people said, you can't ask us to go into that land. Look at our children. They're going to die in there. And so God says, you want to use your kids as a reason why not to trust me? You're all going to die, but your kids will get in. Oh, man. That's Numbers 14 in a nutshell. What an amazing thing. Now, it should serve as a wonderful reminder not only to us, but it should have to them as well. But by the time that we get to the last three of the minor prophets, after we finish with Nehemiah, we're going to find out it wasn't even 2 generations after this event here that God was done talking to them, because they went back into the same debauchery that led them away into their captivity in the first place. Absolutely incredible. Now, as we read that, let's be careful not to say tisk tisk, because we're just as capable of it. We prove it all the time, don't we? So, how many times have we had to come before the Lord? Probably daily. God, forgive me and cleanse me of my unrighteousness and my sin, because I have fallen short. I think every person, every single day, if they don't already do it, should have a prayer that's something like that. That's how you begin your prayer. God, I am not worthy to come before you, but you bid me come to you. Let me acknowledge my sinfulness that you can cleanse me, that I can come before you prepared. Wow. Well, it says here, I love this, and we're going to go look at this in more detail. It's in Exodus chapter 34. Let's read it first, and then we'll go look at the entirety of the text. But you are God. This is Ezra stating this at verse 17, the second half. But you are God. You are ready to pardon, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abundant in kindness, and you did not forsake them. That is not the way that the world looks at God, is it? They think of him as being angry, sitting up there in heaven with a quiver full of lightning bolts that he's just ready to throw. Right? That's the view. So the one thing you want to do is don't draw a lot of attention to yourself, because God just likes to wipe people out. That's the way that the world loves to look at him. He's vengeful, he's angry, he's this, he's that. No, that's not the God of the Bible. Now, what Ezra says here is taken from Exodus 34. Let's go there. Exodus 34. And I'm going to ask you a question. How often do you have people that when you tell them that you're a Christian, have that view of God that he's angry, he's mean, he's punishing, he's all that kind of stuff? Do you ever get that? Do you know how to answer that question effectively? Take them to this. Because again, this is the Old Testament God, as they would say. That angry, mean old God of the Old Testament that told them to wipe out this, that, and the other thing. Here is the time when God reveals himself. Now, this is after the second, or at the time of the giving of the second set of the tablets of the law. The first one was broken when Moses came back and said, "Are you kidding me? You guys are partying with the Egyptian calf. Are you nuts?" That's a loose translation. That's kind of what he said, though. He's just, you got to be kidding me. Well, God gives them a second set of the law, because those ones were broken. Verse 5 of Exodus 34. Now the Lord descended in the cloud, stood with him there, and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful, gracious, long-suffering, means patient and enduring, and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity on the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. Now, some people would read that and say, wow, that sounds so vindictive. Why is God so vengeful? And it's not that at all. It's just basically, hey, look, what your folks do could very well have consequences for you down the road. Ask Ezra and Nehemiah. Remember, they're acknowledging the fathers who had led them to the place that invited the wrath of God and took them away into captivity. So they're having to deal with the consequences, though they weren't the ones who sinned in the way that they did. The fathers did. But they were having to deal with the consequences of it. And that's important for us to recognize too. Look, actions have consequences. And sometimes those consequences can last for generations. But you have here God speaking of himself, here's who I am. That is not the way that the world sees him. And this is one of the things, because folks, it's going to be a debate more and more and more as time goes by. We have people within even the church today among us that are trying to tell us that there are belief systems in the world and it's the same God. Where that is becoming more and more of a debate is that the God of Islam, Allah, is the same as the God of the Bible. That is not true. Because Allah does not forgive sin. Man has to merit his way into righteousness. He has to produce works. Sin's not an issue for them, that they would need someone to sacrifice. They are going to earn their way to heaven by their actions. That is at the essence the core teaching of Islam. For the Bible, we would all know that there is nothing that we can do to merit God's favor. Sin is forgiven because God has provided a means for the forgiveness of sin, Jesus. God made flesh, gave himself for his creation that we could be reconciled to him, independent of our actions. Those two gods could not be more different if we tried to make them more different. So if somebody tells you we worship the same God, that's ignorance, folks. Rank ignorance at that. The God of Islam, the God of the Quran, is not the God of the Bible, period. If you ever want to know, if you know a Muslim, ask them if they could say this of their God. Not the case. Let alone putting it into a New Testament sense to say the Word became flesh and dwelt among us and we beheld his glory. And that God, Jesus, gave his life on a cross for the sin of mankind. That is anathema to them. It is in their own writings that God is not begotten, nor does he beget. That is a way of taking a shot at the Christian understanding that Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us. Okay, we clear on that? And I want you to realize, the more I say that kind of stuff, makes this church a target. You realize that, don't you? If I was to say that in some countries, I could be put in jail for what I just said. I invite violence to me by some people for saying such a thing. But it's just the teaching of Scripture, so I'm not going to hide from it. It's what the Scripture teaches. So here God says, these are characteristics: merciful, gracious, long-suffering and enduring, abounding in goodness and in truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgressions and sin. And in a New Testament sense, we know exactly how he did that. He became flesh, died on a cross for his people because they could not do it themselves. That makes the God of Scripture unlike any. Back to Nehemiah. So if you run into those people, make sure you point them to that and say, this is what God says of himself. And since he said that, let's fast forward into the New Testament sense and see it in action. His long-suffering, his mercy, keeping, graciousness and truth and all that stuff. He showed that in Jesus and paid the price for sin, that he could abolish death eternally. Incredible stuff. So then verse 18. Goes back to another thing in Exodus. Now here, listen, check this out. Verse 18 says, and even when they made a molded calf for themselves and said, this is your God that brought you out of Egypt. Let me point something out to you. What we just read in Exodus 34, where God talks about His long-suffering, His mercy, and His endurance, and His faithfulness, and all that stuff, the events of the golden calf happened in Exodus 32. Get your mind around this. They rebelled in chapter 32 by when Moses is getting the law, they're getting a little tired of stuff. What are we going to do? Moses has been there for a long time. What are we going to do? Well, I don't know. Bring all your gold and we'll see what happens. So remember when Moses comes back and he says to Aaron, what's the deal? There's a calf and you guys are worshiping it. The one that you're saying led us out of Egypt. Well, I don't know. We just threw gold in the fire and that's what popped out. That's the best you can come up with? Now, that's the events of chapter 32, which, if God was anything like me, by the time 34 rolls around, it's not I'm long-suffering and I'm enduring and I'm faithful and merciful and all the rest of it. It's like, you guys have provoked me so much, I'm done. Clean slate, I'll see if I can find somebody else. Instead, we have the events of chapter 32 followed by the events of chapter 34 in Exodus. Even though they provoked to that extent, God who led them out of the captivity or the bondage of Egypt, brought them across the Red Sea, led them by a pillar of fire and cloud by day. Nothing could touch them. They were preserved. God gave them manna. He gave them water. He did all that stuff, and they still rebelled. And yet God remained merciful, loving, faithful, true, gracious, all that stuff. Isn't that good news, folks? Because I provoke Him every day, and we all do. And yet He remains all of those things characteristically. Wow, what a blessing. So even when they made a molded calf for themselves and said, this is your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and worked great provocations, yet in your manifold mercies you did not forsake them in the wilderness. He had every right. He could have done exactly that. He could have, right? But here's one of the questions. And we should be thinking our way through these passages. Look at this. Yet in your manifold mercies you did not forsake them in the wilderness. Think about it. Had he done that, Nehemiah wouldn't have been there saying any of this. So if nothing else, at least to get them to the point of Nehemiah chapter 9, God would have had to have preserved him, because Nehemiah or Ezra is going to give them the history lesson up to this point. So God did not finish everything out. You kept everything going because, God, you had much further down the road plans. From the time that Ezra says these, fast forward to our times, 2,600 years later, God still has things. So He's going to preserve. He didn't wipe things out back then because He's still at work. Great. So the pillar of the cloud did not depart from them by day to lead them on the road, nor did the pillar of fire by night to show them the way that they should go. You also gave them your good spirit to instruct them, and you did not withhold your manna from their mouth, and to give them water for their thirst. He basically reiterates that, taken from Exodus 16. 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not even wear out, taken from Deuteronomy 29. So, you figure after 40 years you'd go through some clothes and shoes and stuff like that. How did that stuff hold up? Supernaturally. Even their clothing made it. Their shoes and all the rest of that after 40 years. Now, some people would look at that and say, come on, Chris, do you expect me to believe that? Absolutely. So God's going to make a pair of shoes last for 40 years? Of course. You think that God can't do something like that? He spoke the universe into existence. Get over yourself. You may not be able to explain it in earthly terms, but can you explain creation? Come on. Moreover, you gave them kingdoms, you gave them nations, and you divided them into districts so that they took possession of the land of Sihon. And so that's from Numbers chapter 21. These were strong cities where they came in and they did the things that they did. It's not as though this was just, a bunch of little towns that they just ran right through. Consider the people that were going in. They were not an established nation. God delivered them into their hands. So it says, They took possessions of Sihon, the land of the king of Heshbon, and the land of Og, of the king of Bashan. You also multiplied their children as the stars of heaven. And that's taken from Genesis 22. After God had made the promise, and He showed him, took Abraham out and said, take a look up. Look at all the stars. Just know that your descendants will be more than what you can see with your eye. Let's remember, at the time that He would have done that, you can't go out and do that tonight, even though it's raining outside right now. But on the clearest of nights, right here in the city, you can't see many stars up in the sky. But get out when there is no light from any source, man-made. You get out in the middle of everything, when there's not a lot of moonlight especially, so you're not getting that light reflecting that way, and you're out in the middle of nowhere, take a look up. It is awe-inspiring. And God knows them all by name and put them there. Spoke them into existence. That's pretty awesome. Well, He says, you also multiplied their children as the stars of heaven. You brought them into the land which you had told of their fathers to go and to possess. And so the people went in. And now we're getting to the point of Joshua. And so the people went in, and they possessed the land, and you had subdued before them the inhabitants of the land of the Canaanites, from Joshua 18. That's when they all started going in. And you gave them into their hands with their kings and the people of the land, that they might do with them as they wished. This is an important part once again. For those people that want to make the argument, how dare they? How dare they do those things? It was their place of inheritance. God owns the land. He can do with it as He wills. Verse 25. So they took these strong cities in this rich land. They possessed houses full of all goods, cisterns that were already dug, vineyards, olive groves, fruit trees in abundance. And so they ate, and they were filled, and they grew fat, and they delighted themselves in your great goodness. Now this was the promise. It was made all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And we're going to go there in just a moment. We'll end with this tonight. We're just going to have to pick up at verse 26 next week. Actually, next week? Yeah, next week we got one more, and then we'll be having communion, the first of the year. What I find interesting in this, and there is a great application to what we're about to read. But Deuteronomy chapter 6 is an incredible chapter, and we're going to only be able to highlight it because of time. I urge you, in your own time, go through and read Deuteronomy 6, and make sure that you read it with the understanding of to whom it was being said at the time, but the application to us as believers are incredible. Deuteronomy chapter 6, let's turn there. Deuteronomy 6. And we'll just read it and then we'll comment a little bit on some of the things. So remember, this was the idea that they were going to inhabit something that was already made. Again, the land was already given to them through covenant all the way back to Abraham. By the time that they came into it, other people were there. And yeah, they were going to displace those people. And it wasn't that they were the usurpers throwing out the people of the land. In God's eyes, the land already belonged to Israel, and whether they understood it or not, those were the usurpers. Now the people were going to come and take the inheritance that had already been given to them. So, it tells us in verse 6. Now this is verse 1 of Deuteronomy 6. Now this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and the judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land that you are crossing over to possess. So they're about to go in. That you may fear the Lord your God, keep His statutes, commandments that He has commanded you, and that your son and your grandson all the days of your life, that they may be prolonged. So these are statutes not only for you, but they're to be observed through the generations. Verse 3, therefore hear, O Israel, be careful to observe it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, has promised to you, that it's a land that is flowing with milk and honey. If you've ever wondered that, you've heard that phrase, it's from here. Flows with milk and honey. It means that it's a great land. Now, the next thing that we're about to read in verse 4 is referred to as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This, when we go to Israel next year, you're going to, if you're going with us, and if you weren't here this morning, if you're going to be going, come and see me. If you're watching us online and you're thinking about going, We are at the end of it. We have to get you secured. So contact me and let me know. Okay, enough for the commercial. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Shema. This is put on the doorposts, and you're going to find out why. But as you walk into a building, if you walk into even your hotel rooms, all of them have a little thing called a mezuzah. And in the mezuzah, it's a little thing that's up on the wall, and inside of it is the Shema. It's a reminder to them of the oneness of God. And so every place that you go, the doorways have that. And what they would do, one of two things. They would either kiss their hand, put it on it, or they would touch it and bring their hand to their mouth as a way of acknowledgement as they would enter in through the door. Now, where did that come from, that tradition? You're reading it right here, verse 5. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength. One of the things that Jesus said you're supposed to do. What are the greatest of the commandments? He points back to this. Love the Lord your God. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you can do those, you'll keep all of the law. 2 things. How easy could it be? Just 2 things. And we can fulfill all of the law. So all you got to do is love God above everything else. And then because of that, you'll love your neighbor. Simple, isn't it? So we can earn our way to heaven. That's great, isn't it? No. Because you can't do the first one, let alone the second. You want to prove it? Wait till the first stoplight on the way back home tonight. If somebody cuts you off or does something really stupid, you're not going to be loving on them too much. The person that's driving too slow and makes you miss the light, you're not loving them a whole lot. You're calling curses down on them, aren't you? Or it's just me. All right. Now, I love this. Verse 6. And these words which I command to you today, they will be in your heart. Think about what David had said about the word. Your word I have hidden where? My heart, that I might not sin against you. Now, if you want to try to make the belief in God an intellectual pursuit, He's so far above the intellect. Man cannot grasp. It's a futile attempt to try to figure out God in the intellectual sense. That's why we even have the word faith, because He's so far beyond the intellect. Belief is a matter of the heart. Just as we studied this morning, right here, it's the same thing. They will be in your heart. You will connect with God that way. You will come to know who He is. It is a matter of the heart. You will teach these diligently to your children, and you will talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. That's like all the time. That is to be a 24/7, if you will, pursuit. But the idea of teaching them diligently to your children. I hear this so many times, and every time I hear it, it makes me crazy. We're not going to enforce our religious belief upon our children. We're just going to let them figure that out for themselves. We will let them come to their own decision. That's stupid. Makes me crazy. They are going to have to do what they are going to do based upon what you tell them, but you tell them. You will answer for how you deal with your children. Now, some people had children before they got saved, and they may not have instructed them in the ways of the Lord. That's a different matter altogether. But for the person who knows the truth, who has children, and does not instruct their children accordingly, they will give account for that. Well, that's under the law. If it was under the law, how much more so now that we know the real truth about Jesus and who He is? Do not leave it to the world to instruct your kids, because they will. Right? Look at the garbage that's being heaped upon them through media and the schools. Good grief. It's everything that you can do to deprogram them at the end of every day because of the filth. Instruct them. You will teach these things to your children, and they will be upon your lips at all times. So that idea that you will talk about them when you're in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. And you will bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets to your eyes. So if you've ever seen the really traditional Jewish people when they're praying, and we'll see this actually if you're going with us on the trip, there's going to come a time when we're flying out there and you're going to see these Jewish men who are going to wrap themselves in their prayer shawl, and some of them will have the little square box-looking kind of a thing on their foreheads. It's called a phylactery. And inside that, the Shema is there. It's a reminder to them, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's a reminder to them, and they will have it there as a frontlet to their eyes. It's the thing that's on their doorposts as they walk into their house. Unfortunately, it's just become a ritual and a tradition, but it should be something that is life. Well, you will write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Why do you see those things on the doorposts? That's why right there. Why are there phylacteries everywhere that you look, or on the heads of those people? And why are there mezuzahs everywhere, every doorway that you walk into? Right there. That's why. So it will be that when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, and when you have eaten and you are full, then beware. Wow. We'll read the rest of that in just a moment, but beware. Everything has been done for you. Remember, this is God saying, when you get into the land. Ezra, in the book of Nehemiah, is saying, remember when God told us? And now here we are, after all the years of displacement, after all the things that had happened, we forgot where God had brought us. New Testament sense? Let's face it, folks, we cannot earn our way to heaven. The idea that Jesus has paid the price for sin and we are forgiven in him and made whole, that is a cistern that we did not dig. Those are vineyards we didn't plant. Those are houses that we did not build. All of that work was done by him for us. We can't do any of it. He has done everything for us. Let's remember, when we get into that place, relationship with God, and when he has done all the things that he has done, let's make sure that we do not forget. Beware lest we forget the Lord who brought us out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Great admonition for us. Let us never forget what God has done. Let us not forget, in a New Testament sense, all the work that Jesus has done. Beware. Do not coast. Do not be stagnant. Press forward, because he has done great things. You see the application? What you read in Deuteronomy and say, what does it mean to a Christian? It means everything. All that God has done. So, we'll have to end there. We'll pick up at verse 26. I figured we'd get well into chapter 10 tonight. Well, whoops. This is, as far as history is concerned, and the reminding of history, they did it constantly. Book of Acts. Every time that they had a public address, from Paul to Peter to Stephen, those guys, they were always saying, remember what's brought us to this point, remembering their history. So he does here as well. We'll pick it up in verse 26 next week. We'll finish out chapter 9 and get into chapter 10 next week. Let's stand and we'll have a closing prayer, and they'll lead us in a closing song. Father, we thank you once again for your faithfulness. Incredible lessons that we can learn from history when you speak to us through your word. We give you thanks this day. We give you all the praise and the honor. We pray that you would give us ears to hear at all times, paying attention to such matters. Lord, help us to be faithful to your word and growing in the grace that you provide for us. Help us to be mindful and not forgetting the things that you have done. As your word says to them, that they would beware lest they forget. Help us to at all times be mindful of the great things that you've done. We give you thanks for this evening. We thank you for your word. Pray that you would glorify yourself in our lives. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, O Lord, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and renew a right spirit within me. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, O Lord, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and renew a right spirit within me. And renew a right spirit within me. Lord bless you as you go. Have a great week.